Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to have you back with me for another bedtime story. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd be really grateful if you could give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps motivate me to keep creating more stories. Tonight's story is called The Gentle Power of J.P. Morgan, a bedtime story. Chapter 1. The Boy from Hartford. Quiet beginning under gentle skies. In the stillness of a spring morning in 1837, in the peaceful town of Hartford, Connecticut, a baby was born who would one day change the world, not with a sword or crown, but with quiet choices, steady thinking, and the whisper of paper turning in a banker's hand. His name was John Pierpont Morgan, but most people would come to know him simply as J.P. The Morgan home stood tall and proper on a tree-lined street where robins chirped gently in the morning and the scent of lilacs floated in the breeze. Inside that home, young Pierpont was rocked to sleep beneath oil lamps and lullabies, the soft clicking of grandfather clocks marking time as his mother sang to him. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was a man of trade and numbers, and he kept books filled with figures and letters on his mahogany desk. Pierpont would one day follow in those footsteps, though no one could have guessed just how far, from his earliest days. Pierpont was no ordinary boy. He watched things carefully. The fire flickered in the hearth, how people's voices rose and fell like music, and how the world moved with rhythm and pattern. When other children ran wild outdoors, Pierpont often sat quietly with a book, his hands neatly folded in his lap. But he wasn't cold or distant, he just liked order. Pierpont always listened before he spoke, his mother said, and when he did speak, he made you stop and think. His father took notice of this quiet mind. He encouraged Pierpont to explore puzzles, to read about faraway lands, and to study how ships crossed oceans, not just by sail, but by planning, trade, and trust. The boy grew fascinated, not with pirates and adventures like other boys, but with the smooth logic of the world behind the curtain, banks, businesses, and the people who built them. When Pierpont was still young, he became very ill. A strange fever took over, and he was bedridden for months. The doctors called it rheumatic fever, and it affected his skin and joints. For a long time, he lay still in bed, looking out the window at the leaves rustling gently in the wind, but his mind stayed active. He read books his mother brought him about history, art, philosophy, and though the illness left him with chronic discomfort for the rest of his life, he never let it slow him down. "If I can't run like the others," he once said to a family friend, "then I will outthink them." He was only 10. Junius Morgan's career as a banker soon took the family overseas. Pierpont, still just a teenager, boarded a ship across the Atlantic and set foot in Europe, first in London, then in Switzerland, and eventually in Germany. The young boy from Connecticut found himself in cities filled with art, music, and industry. He studied at the Institut Sillig in Switzerland, a quiet, disciplined place nestled among the Alps, where students learned to think deeply and live thoughtfully. There, Pierpont studied math, French, and the moral lessons of ancient philosophers. He wasn't the strongest boy in the class, but he was often the most respected. Teachers saw in him a seriousness uncommon in boys his age, quiet ambition, like still water hiding great depth. He would later attend the University of Göttingen in Germany, where he studied under some of Europe's finest minds. It was there that he became fluent in German and absorbed the structured ways of German finance and thought. Evenings passed in the candlelit dormitory, Pierpont reading letters from his father and carefully noting ideas in a black-bound journal. He wasn't dreaming of wealth, not yet. He was dreaming of systems, of how the world worked, of how trust could move mountains. Asterisk, in 1857, after many years abroad, Pierpont returned to America, his voice deeper, his posture confident, and his mind sharpened like a chisel. New York City was growing fast. The streets buzzed with carts, horses, and men calling out the prices of goods. Steamships whistled at the harbor, and buildings climbed higher into the sky. It was a place where fortunes were made and lost every day. But young J.P. Morgan, just 20 years old, walked these noisy streets with the quiet grace of someone who already knew where he was going. He joined a banking firm connected to his father's work and began learning from the inside. At night, he still lit his lamp, read balance sheets, and wrote in his journal. He never rushed. He never gambled. He simply prepared. And while others shouted in the stock exchange, Morgan was the kind of man who would one day calm entire markets with a whisper. Asterisk. So ends the first chapter in the life of J.P. Morgan, a boy born in Hartford, raised on books, tempered by illness, and shaped by Europe's wisdom, now stood on the edge of America's greatest financial age. He didn't yet know he would guide railroads, merge empires, and rescue the nation's banks. But he was ready, because J.P. Morgan didn't chase power. He built it quietly. And now, dear listener, rest your head. Let the gentle pace of this story guide you to sleep. For like Pierpont, you too are on a journey, one of growth, discovery, and quiet strength. Sleep well, and we'll continue in Chapter 2, where Morgan takes his first steps into the world of American finance. Chapter 2. Learning the language of money, a young man's quiet steps into a world of finance. The city of New York, in the year 1857, was alive with motion. Horse-drawn carriages rolled along cobbled streets. Newsboys called out the headlines. Ships docked at the harbor, bringing goods and gold from faraway lands. And amid it all, a young man named J. Pierpont Morgan, just 20 years old, was stepping gently into a world that pulsed with ambition and risk. Unlike many of his peers, Pierpont didn't chase fortune with loud words or hurried steps. He moved carefully, with the same stillness and precision he had shown as a child. He had returned from Europe with more than just knowledge. He had returned with perspective. He had studied systems, people, and power, and now he would quietly begin to use what he had learned. Asterisk. Pierpont's first job was with Duncan, Sherman and Company, an American branch of his father's English bank, George Peabody and Co. His office was modest, a wooden desk, a green glass lamp, and shelves stacked with ledgers bound in leather. He spent his days reviewing transactions, analyzing risks, and more than anything, listening. Older bankers whispered about the Morgan boy, who seemed to understand balance sheets better than most men twice his age. But Pierpont never bragged. He kept his observations to himself, always learning, always refining his craft. To him, banking was not just about money, it was about trust, about making decisions others could rely on, about knowing when to say yes and when to gently say no. Asterisk. That same year, the nation faced a crisis, the Panic of 1857. Banks trembled, businesses failed, people lost jobs, homes, and hope. But in the chaos, Pierpont remained steady. He watched the markets dip and sway, not with fear, but with fascination. He studied the patterns, the reactions, the causes beneath the surface. In this time of uncertainty, Pierpont made one of his first great decisions. He helped organize a loan to a faltering company, but only after carefully reviewing every detail, every risk. His calm judgment helped save dozens of jobs and earned him quiet respect. "He doesn't blink when others panic," said one senior banker. And they were right. As the years passed, Pierpont's reputation grew. He joined Dabney, Morgan & Co., and eventually helped form his own partnership, J. Pierpont Morgan & Company, with strong ties to his father's firm in London. It was the beginning of a dynasty built in a rush, but crafted with care. He worked long hours, but never complained. He believed in doing things right, not fast. His office became a sanctuary of thought, where the tick of the clock and the rustle of paper were the only sounds. And though he dealt with millions, his values never changed. He believed that a man's word was more important than his wealth. Outside of work, Pierpont found joy in quiet pleasures. He developed a deep love for art and culture, often wandering through galleries and auctions. He began to collect pieces of history, rare books, ancient coins, Renaissance paintings. At first, people were surprised. A banker with a soul for beauty, they wondered. But for Pierpont, finance and art were not so different. Both required vision, both needed patience, and both, in their own way, brought order to a world that could feel chaotic. He once said, "Money is a tool, beauty is a treasure." On weekends, when business allowed, Pierpont would escape the noise of the city aboard his beloved yacht. The Corsair, the sea, soothed him. He would stand at the bow, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the horizon with the same steady gaze he gave to markets and mergers. The waves rolled gently, and Pierpont breathed deeply. Here he was, not a financier. He was a man, a thinker, a quiet observer of the world's great tides. By his early 30s, Pierpont Morgan was not yet the titan he would become, but he had laid the foundation. He had shown the world that calm could be powerful, and that a gentle mind could guide mighty forces. He had not shouted, he had not rushed, he had simply learned, and in doing so, he had begun to shape a future that would stretch far beyond his office walls. As the city lights flickered and the sky darkened over New York, Morgan would return to his townhouse, light a small fire, and sit in silence. The world outside buzzed with deals and ambition, but inside, all was peaceful. He believed that clarity came not in noise, but in stillness. So now, dear listener, let the rhythm of Pierpont's early life lull you into rest. Close your eyes and think of the boy who became a banker not by storm, but by steady stream. And as you drift to sleep, remember, sometimes the quietest voices build the strongest bridges. Good night. When you're ready, Chapter 3 will gently guide us deeper into the heart of Morgan's empire. Chapter 3. The young banker in New York, where quiet choices begin to shape a noisy world. By the early 1860s, New York had become a city of clamor and ambition. Horse-drawn trolleys rolled down muddy streets. Steam whistles echoed through the harbor, and buildings rose higher each year. Amid the growing hum of commerce and industry, a calm figure moved through the halls of finance, not with the frenzy of youth, but with the measured steps of a man already wise beyond his years. That man was J. Pierpont Morgan, now in his late 20s. He was no longer just the son of a banker. He was becoming a banker in his own right, quiet, thoughtful, and increasingly powerful. New York was fast, but Pierpont was still in a tall office building on Wall Street. He arranged his papers in neat stacks. The morning sun filtered through tall windows as he reviewed letters, transactions, and reports. His days were long, but never frantic. He believed that great decisions came not from pressure, but from patience. He still lit his green glass lamp each evening, still wrote notes in elegant handwriting, and still believed in character above profit. People began to notice. He says little, whispered a clerk, but when he speaks, people listen. In 1864, Pierpont formed a new partnership with Charles H. Dabney. Their firm Dabney, Morgan & Co. handled foreign exchange and government bonds. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was important, especially now as the Civil War raged across America. Pierpont did not fight on the battlefield, but he served his country in another way by financing it. He helped sell war bonds, ensuring the Union had the money it needed to survive. He did not boast about it. He simply did what needed to be done. When others hesitated, he calculated. When markets panicked, he remained still and quietly. His influence grew by the end of the war. Morgan had established himself as a gentleman banker, impeccably dressed, precise in speech, and fearless in finance. He carried a silver-tipped cane, wore tailored suits, and greeted visitors with a steady gaze that made even the most arrogant men pause. He rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. People trusted Morgan, one financier recalled, not because he promised the most, but because he promised only what he knew he could deliver. In 1869, Morgan faced a challenge that tested his calm to notorious financiers. Jay Gould and James Fisk had tried to corner the gold market. Their reckless plan sent markets into chaos, culminating in what became known as Black Friday. Prices surged, then collapsed. Fortunes vanished in a day. But Morgan, who had quietly stayed away from the gold craze, remained untouched. He had seen the risk and stepped back. When the dust settled, he was one of the few left standing. People looked to him differently after that. He wasn't just clever, he was wise. By the early 1870s, Pierpont was ready to take his next step. He ended his partnership with Dabney and formed a new firm, Drexel, Morgan & Co., alongside the respected Anthony Drexel of Philadelphia. This partnership would become the foundation for what the world would later know as J.P. Morgan & Co. Morgan now had the tools, the capital, and the freedom to shape American industry in ways few could imagine. But he remained the same at heart, measured, principled, and private. He still came home each night to a quiet house, still sailed his yacht when he needed peace, still believed that a handshake could be as binding as any contract, though often seen as stern. Morgan had a tender side. He loved books and collected rare manuscripts. He read poetry. He enjoyed long conversations with artists, philosophers, and scientists. At dinner parties, he spoke little, but when he did, it was often with wit and warmth. He supported charities quietly, helped friends in need discreetly, and cared deeply about the future, not just of business, but of civilization itself. His world was one of ledgers and balance sheets, yes, but it was also filled with beauty, kindness, and thought. As the decade drew to a close, Morgan's position in American finance was secure, but he was not content. He didn't seek money for its own sake. He wanted to build railroads, companies, institutions, stability. He dreamed of an America not torn by speculation or greed, but united by purpose. He believed business, done well, could be a force for order, peace, and progress. It would take time, it would take vision, and most of all it would take calm. As twilight fell across the city, the streets of New York dimmed, but Morgan's office remained lit. He sat at his desk, quietly studying a map of railroad lines, his fingertips tracing the path from New York to Chicago, then on to San Francisco. He was not thinking of profits. He was thinking of connection, of how steel rails could unite a nation, of how calm minds could move mountains. And with that, we bring Chapter 3 to a close. Now, rest your head, dear listener. Let the stillness of Morgan's world wrap around you like a soft blanket. For in this tale, the storms are quiet, and the victories are gentle. Sleep well, and return when you're ready for Chapter 4. Morgan begins building more than wealth. He begins building empire. Chapter 4. Building empires, calmly steel rails, and the silent shaping of a nation. By the late 1870s, America was changing. The war was over, but a new kind of battle had begun, a race to build the nation from coast to coast, across fields and forests, through deserts and over mountains. Railroads stitched cities together like threads in a giant quilt. And behind many of those stitches, sitting quietly at his desk in Lower Manhattan, was J. Pierpont Morgan. He didn't lay tracks. He didn't swing hammers, but his calm hand guided the steel. The railroads were more than just trains. They were lifelines. They carried coal, wheat, people, and dreams. But they were also fragile. Many were overextended, poorly managed, and drowning in debt. Competitors clashed. Prices crashed. Investors panicked. It was chaos. But Morgan saw something else in the mess potential. He believed in order, in structure, in the quiet strength of organization. So, one by one, he began to bring calm to the storm. Morgan had a gift few others possessed, the ability to bring people together, even rivals. When railroads went bankrupt, he stepped in not with threats, but with trust. He invited owners, bankers, and executives into his library, where the fire crackled softly and the windows overlooked the gray streets of New York. Gently, he would begin, his voice even and low. Let us find a better way. He would spend hours, sometimes days, negotiating peace between companies. He reorganized railroads like a composer rearranging music, each note fitting into a grander harmony. The process became known as Morganization, and when he was done, the railroads worked again, efficient, stable, and strong. By the 1880s, Morgan was no longer just a respected banker. He was becoming a giant of American industry. But he didn't seek fame. He stayed out of the spotlight, working in quiet offices filled with books, charts, and quiet conversation. He believed in two things, above all, integrity and discipline. He demanded excellence from those around him, and though he could be firm, he was always fair. People respected him not because he was rich, but because he was steady enough, whose word held more weight than any document. Morgan's circle included some of the most powerful men of the John Carnegie, the Steel King, John D. Rockefeller, the oil baron, and Cornelius Vanderbilt, master of the railroads. But unlike many of them, Morgan did not build a single product. He built bridges between people, companies, and ideas. He listened to dreams and shaped them into plans. And when business giants clashed, they came to Morgan not as conquerors, but as seekers of peace. One of the most dramatic examples came during the battle for the Erie. Railroad, a fierce contest of wills between clashing tycoons. The railroad had fallen into disarray and chaos loomed. Morgan stepped in quietly. He bought shares. He studied the books. And then he called a meeting in his private library. There were no reporters, no shouting, no public accusations, only calm. Voices, a ticking clock, a silver tray of tea and biscuits. When the meeting ended, the warring sides had agreed to a new Plan 1, shaped by Morgan's reason, guided by his fairness. The Erie Railroad breathed again, though his name now carried weight across continents. Morgan remained somewhat of a mystery to the public. He was rarely photographed. He never gave speeches. He had no interest in showmanship. But those who knew him described a man who loved quiet routines. Mornings with a single cup of black coffee, walks through his art gallery, evenings aboard the Corsair, watching the stars, the rustle of parchment. As he wrote thoughtful letters, he lived simply, though elegantly, and he expected the same honesty from himself that he demanded from others. By the close of the decade, Morgan had reorganized dozens of railroads. He had helped create a stronger, more stable network across the country. Thanks to his guidance, American industry began to flow smoothly from coast to coast. He didn't leave his mark with monuments. He left it with systems that worked, companies that endured, and leaders who learned to value thought over noise. As another day ended, Morgan sat by the fire in his private study. A model train rested on his shelf, a gift from a grateful railroad company. He held it in his hand, turned it slowly, and smiled. It wasn't the steel he cared about. It was what the steel enabled: connection, growth, peace, and so. Dear listener, let your mind rest as this chapter closes. Think of Morgan not as a titan with a roar, but as a builder with a whisper, a man who shaped empires, not with fury, but with focus. Close your eyes now. Let the rhythm of trains, rolling softly across the land he helped build, carry you into dreams. Good night. In Chapter 5, we'll watch as Morgan faces a national crisis and calms the storm once again. Chapter 5. The man who saved Wall Street when the nation trembled. He stayed committed. Was the autumn of 1907. The leaves in New York City were beginning to turn gold and red, and the wind carried the scent of smoke and change. But the beauty of the season masked a growing fear a storm was coming, not in the sky, but in the heart of America's economy. Banks were failing. The stock market had collapsed, and panic swept through Wall Street like wildfire. But in the shadows of that fear, in a quiet library lit by soft gas lamps and lined with books of leather and gold, sat a 70-year-old man with silver hair, clear eyes, and steady hands. His name was J. Pierpont Morgan, and while others shouted, ran, and feared the worst, he stayed still and got to work. It began with a small bank, then another, and another. Rumors spread quickly faster than facts ever could. People lined up outside banks, desperate to withdraw their money. The more they rushed, the worse it became. It wasn't just numbers anymore, it was trust, and trust was fading fast. Even some of the country's strongest financial houses teetered on the edge of collapse. The government was powerless. There was no central bank yet, no Federal Reserve to stabilize the system. And so all eyes turned to one man, Pierpont. Morgan did not panic. He closed the doors to his private library on Madison Avenue and gathered the most powerful bankers in the country. They came with worry in their eyes, fear in their hearts. But Morgan was calm. The room was silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the soft click of a clock on the mantel. He looked each man in the eye and spoke in a voice that was quiet but unshakable. The system will hold, he said, if we hold it together. They listened. For days, Morgan worked without rest. He studied balance sheets, called in favors, and arranged emergency loans. Some companies were allowed to fall, others were quietly rescued. Decisions were made with precision, not to protect profits, but to preserve stability. One night, he locked a group of bank presidents inside his library until they agreed to pool their funds and rescue the failing trust company of America. No one leaves, he said, until we have peace. They stayed, they signed, and slowly the panic began to calm. Morgan's actions in 1907 saved countless businesses, jobs, and futures. He did not do it for applause. In fact, he disliked attention. When the newspapers called him a hero, he said, "Only I did what was necessary, nothing more." But the truth was clear. One man, sitting quietly in a wood-paneled room, had held back the collapse of an entire economy. He had become, in the eyes of the world, not just a banker, but a symbol of stability, order, and quiet strength. What gave Morgan such power? It wasn't just money. It was trust. People believed in him because he had always acted with honor. He did not speculate wildly. He did not chase headlines. He believed that business should serve society, not rule it. And so, in a time of darkness, people looked to Morgan as they might to a lighthouse during a storm after the crisis passed. President Theodore Roosevelt and Congress began to think more seriously about how to prevent future panics. Morgan's actions had exposed a truth. One man should not have to save a nation alone. In time, this would lead to the creation of the Federal Reserve System. Morgan had not sought this role, but by stepping forward when no one else could, he had changed the course of American financial history. After the dust settled, Morgan returned to his usual life. He sat once again on the deck of the Corsair, the breeze tugging gently at his coat. He watched the water shimmer in the late afternoon light. The harbor was calm, so was he. He had done his duty, quietly, honorably, and now he rested. In the years to come, people would continue to debate J.P. Morgan's legacy, his power, his influence, his wealth. But those who truly understood him knew this. He was a man who believed in balance, not noise, in discipline, not drama, in service, not spectacle. He never raised a sword, he raised trust, and with it he held a nation together. And now, dear listener, let your breath slow. Let the silence of Morgan's library surround you. Imagine the firelight dancing across polished wood, the voices hushed, the crisis resolved. Sleep comes easier when we know there are people who, in times of chaos, remain calm. Good night. When you're ready, Chapter 6 will take us deeper into Morgan's great creations, steel, electricity, and the shaping of a modern age. Chapter 6, Steel, Electricity, and giants shaping the modern world without raising a hammer as the dawn of the 20th century broke over the American landscape. Something new was rising, not just cities and factories, but a new kind of power, the power to build, to illuminate, and to unite the country in ways never seen before at the heart of this new era. In a room filled with quiet focus and velvet chairs sat a man who did not invent machines or lay tracks. He built no bridges with his hands, but he connected people, ideas, and industries with unmatched precision. That man was J. Pierpont Morgan, and now he would step beyond railroads. Now he would forge something even greater empires of steel and electricity. By the late 1800s, Andrew Carnegie was the king of steel. His mills roared with heat and fire, forging the beams that held up America's growing cities. But the steel industry was divided, competitive, restless. Morgan saw the danger in this disunity and the opportunity in its potential. He invited Carnegie's representatives to his office. No shouting, no threats, just conversation, serious and purposeful. In 1901, he bought Carnegie Steel for $480 million, a breathtaking sum then, in a single, quiet stroke of genius. He combined it with several smaller companies to form U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in the world. It was not just a company. It was a symbol. There were no parades, no brass bands to announce the birth of U.S. Steel, only silence. Morgan leaned back in his leather chair, lit a cigar, and nodded slowly. His hands had done what others only dreamed of. He had brought rivals together and created something vast, something stable, something lasting. He didn't celebrate. He simply moved to the next project, because Morgan believed that when one piece fits, the next must follow. But steel wasn't the only force changing the world. Electricity, mysterious, glowing, and alive, was spreading across the nation. And at its center stood two great minds, Thomas Edison, the inventor, and George Westinghouse, the engineer. Their inventions sparked the imagination, but their companies needed direction, organization, strength. They needed someone who could see the future and shape it gently. Morgan stepped in. In the 1890s, Morgan helped finance Edison's electric company, but he soon realized that Edison's direct current DC was losing ground to Westinghouse's alternating current AC. There was friction, there was confusion, there was waste. Morgan, as always, saw the bigger picture. He helped orchestrate a merger between Edison's companies and several others. From the Union rose General Electric, new company, balanced, strong, and guided by Morgan's steady hand. It would bring light to streets, homes, and factories. It would change how the world lived. Morgan was not an engineer. He did not tinker in labs. He did not invent. But without him, so many inventions would have faded into chaos or competition. He saw the dreams of others, Carnegie, Edison. Westinghouse helped turn them into working realities. He was the architect behind the architects, the organizer of visionaries, the quiet engineer of dreams. Even as he shaped industry, Morgan never forgot his love for beauty. He continued to collect rare books, manuscripts, and paintings. His walls were covered with the wisdom of centuries. When others bought mansions to show off, Morgan bought knowledge to preserve it. His favorite hours were spent not in boardrooms, but in galleries. He believed that the mind needed both number and wonder, and in the soft light of his library, surrounded by sculpture and scripture, he found peace by the turn of the century. Morgan had helped build more than just railroads. He had shaped the modern world, lit by electricity, framed by steel, and connected by banks he helped make strong. But even now, with all his power, he stayed the same, measured, private, polite. People bowed to him in public, but in his heart, he was still the boy from Hartford, quietly curious, endlessly thoughtful, as twilight settled over the rooftops of New York, and the hum of electric lights buzzed quietly through the streets. Morgan sat once more in his favorite chair, a map of railroads on the table, a miniature model of U.S. Steel on the shelf, and beside him a small lamp that burned with Edison's invention. The world had changed, and he had changed it without noise. Sleep well, dear listener, tonight, as you rest beneath electric light, wrapped in the comfort of steel-built cities. Remember the man who brought those forces together, a man of patience, a man of peace, a man who built giants with grace in Chapter 7. We'll step back from business and glimpse the private world of J.P. Morgan, the art, the books, the quiet evenings away from the market's roar. Chapter 7, A Private Life in Public Life, the quiet corners of a powerful man's world by the early 1900s. J. Pierpont Morgan had helped shape the bones of modern America. Railroads hung across the land. Steel supported the skies. Electricity danced along wires and lit the homes of a growing nation. But Morgan himself, this man who so often stood at the center of change, remained a mystery to most. Newspapers speculated. The public wondered. He rarely gave interviews, and when he did, his answers were few. He was, in many ways, like his own quiet office, grand, serious, private town, full of stories hidden from view. Let us now step into the softer light of Morgan's life, a life beyond finance, a life filled with art, books, family, and quiet reflection. Morgan was not just a banker, he was a collector, not of riches. He had long since stopped caring about numbers on a page, but of beauty, of history, and of the human soul expressed in art. In his home and offices, walls were lined with rare paintings and sculptures. Behind glass cases sat ancient manuscripts, early printed books, and precious religious texts. There were Egyptian artifacts, Italian bronzes, and medieval stained glass. When Morgan walked among them, he didn't rush. He paused. He admired. He listened, as if the past were speaking softly just for him. As his collection grew, so did his dream to create a sanctuary for knowledge and beauty. In 1906, Morgan opened the Morgan Library just off Madison Avenue in New York, city built of stone and silence. It was not a vault, but a gifted place where scholars and dreamers alike could explore the past. Inside, warm, light-touched shelves of illuminated manuscripts and Gutenberg Bibles. The scent of old leather and ink floated through the halls, a place of quiet, of reverence. It was one of Morgan's greatest achievements, not a corporation, not a railway, but a temple of thought. At home, Morgan was different. He was stern, yes, but deeply loyal and affectionate in his own quiet way. He loved his children, especially his daughter, Louisa, and his son, Jack, who would one day carry the Morgan name forward. He often invited his family on trips aboard his grand yacht, the Corsair. They would sail away from the roar of Wall Street into the calm of open seas. There, he was simply father. He would read to them from his favorite books, speak about history, and sometimes sit in silence as the wind moved through the sails. No stock reports, no leisure. Just the C&A moment of peace. Morgan's yacht, the Corsair, was not a symbol of luxury, but of solitude. It was where he escaped the relentless pull of business, where he breathed deeply, far from the crowded rooms of finance. He once said the Corsair is my real office. There, he studied books, he wrote letters, he listened to the waves, and watched the horizon stretch endlessly ahead. Some said that out at sea, Morgan looked happiest a man, not of money, but of moments. Though raised in the Episcopal Church, Morgan did not preach his beliefs. He practiced them quietly through his actions. He donated to charities, supported churches, paid off debts for struggling institutions, and he never sought credit. When asked about faith, he said, "My principles are simple. Do the right thing, even when no one is watching." His religion, like his leadership, was based in integrity. Morgan's appearance was as commanding as his presence. He had piercing eyes and a large nose. Twisted slightly by a skin condition he carried all his life. Children sometimes stared, strangers whispered, but those who sat with him forgot his features within minutes. Because it wasn't his face they remembered, it was his mind, his calm, his kindness, cloaked in gravity. One artist said, "You don't paint J.P. Morgan, you feel him." As the century turned, the world changed rapidly, but Morgan never tried to keep up with fads or fashion. He aged with dignity, surrounded by his books, his family, and the quiet rhythm of thought. His legacy was no longer just in steel or stocks, it was in libraries, in honor, and in the stillness that follows a great deed done humbly. As evening drew near, Morgan would sit by the fire, a thick book resting on his knees, the light from a single lamp casting shadows on the ceiling. He might smile at a line of poetry or pause at a passage of scripture. Outside, the city roared, but inside, all was peace. And now, dear listener, as you drift to sleep, let this side of Morgan linger with you. Not the tycoon, not the banker, but the quiet collector of wisdom who gave to the world not just business, but beauty, balance, and stillness. Good night when you're ready. We'll continue with Chapter 8 as Morgan's legacy grows through mentorship and the creation of the enduring House of Morgan. Chapter 8, The House That Trust Built a Legacy, Passed with Calm Hands. The first years of the 20th century moved gently forward. The world around J.P. Morgan was changing. Automobiles rumbled through dusty streets. Skyscrapers climbed higher. Telephones rang in distant rooms. But at the center of this bustling new age, one thing remained still, steady, and deeply rooted: the quiet strength of Morgan's influence. He no longer had to prove himself. His name alone carried power, but rather than use it to dominate, he chose instead to guide, to shape, to teach. Now, in the later chapters of his life, Morgan was preparing something even more important than companies or contracts. He was preparing a legacy. Morgan's banking firm, J.P. Morgan & Co., had become something unique. It was not just a business, it was an institution, People called it the House of Morgan, and the name suited it well, for within its walls was order, tradition, and quiet excellence. The firm did not advertise, it did not boast, it simply operated with integrity, and the world came to rely on it. If you entered its offices, you might hear the scratch of a fountain pen, the soft closing of ledgers, the rustle of morning newspapers. There were no wild cheers, no ringing, bells. Only discipline. Only trust. Morgan knew he would not live forever, and so he began the most delicate work of all, preparing others to carry his vision forward. His son, J.P. Jack Morgan Jr., was already working at the firm, serious, thoughtful, and intelligent. Morgan guided him patiently, not with lectures, but with quiet example. Let your actions be your words, he told Jack. He also mentored young bankersmen who would one day guide the world's finances. He taught them how to read more than numbers, how to read people, how to know when to take a risk, and when to simply wait. And always, he reminded them, character is capital. By now, world leaders came to Morgan as they would to kings, presidents, prime ministers, and princes all visited his library. They didn't come for money alone. They came for wisdom, for stability. Once, when a European nation faced financial ruin, it was Morganot, a government, who calmed the crisis with a single decision. He offered no speech, no grand promise, just his presence and a quiet promise to act. It was enough. At home, Morgan remained a gentle, if sometimes distant, figure. He still read in the evening, still walked among his art, still boarded the Corsair when the noise grew too loud, but he always made time for his family sharing stories, listening to Jack's ideas and supporting Louise's dreams. He had once ruled with precision. Now he led with encouragement. He was no longer building structures. He was building people. As Morgan aged, the public's opinion of him shifted again. Some still feared his power. They called him a money king and whispered about monopoly. But more and more, others began to understand. He had used his power not to control, but to stabilize, not to conquer, but to protect. And through it all, he had remained human flawed, yes, but guided by principles that did not change with the wind. By 1910, much of the financial world bore Morgan's fingerprints, railroads that ran on time, steel that supported cities' electricity that lit the night, libraries that preserved the past, and people, young bankers and old dreamers alike, who had learned from his calm. He had shaped a world, not of noise, but of quiet strength. Morgan never rushed his final years. He did not cling to power. He did not try to stop time. Instead, he walked a little slower, read a little deeper, and gave a little more. He knew what most men forgot, that legacies aren't left behind, they are passed on like a candle lit from another's flame. Asterisk. As dusk settled across the skyline of New York, the golden light touched the pillars of the Morgan firm. Inside, the next generation worked quietly, diligently, in the same tradition that had begun with one thoughtful man. And in his home, Morgan closed the book, leaned back in his chair, and smiled softly at the world he had helped shape, not with thunder, but with thought, not with conquest, but with calm. Rest now, dear listener. Let the rhythm of wisdom passed from one hand to another guide you into rest. For this story, like Morgan's, legacy moves forward quietly, faithfully, gently. Good night. When you're ready, Chapter 9 will bring us to to Morgan's final years his farewell, and the enduring strength of a life built on principle. Chapter 9. The final season, a gentle farewell to a man of quiet might by the spring of 1913. The world Morgan had helped build was in full bloom. Trains crossed continents. Cities sparkled with electric light. Banks stood like fortresses. Libraries kept knowledge safe in rooms of gold and ink. His name was whispered in boardrooms, spoken in presidential halls, and etched into the history of a nation. But J. Pierpont, Morgan himself, was growing tired. He was now 75. The strong frame had softened. The sharp voice had grown quieter, and even the keen eyes behind his glasses blinked more slowly. Still, his mind, his steady, beautiful mind, remained ever alert, and now he was preparing for something no man can avoid, his final chapter. In early 1913, Morgan decided to visit Rome, a city he loved, a city of stone, of story, and of silence. He had always admired Italy's art, its architecture, its timelessness, and perhaps he knew, deep inside, that this would be a farewell tour. He arrived quietly, with no fanfare. He visited churches and galleries. He strolled through ruins and gardens, lost in thought. The people of Rome barely noticed him, for he asked for nothing but space and peace. But peace, he soon found, would come in another form while in Rome. Morgan fell ill. At first, it was only fatigue. Then came fever, and finally stillness. He was taken to the Grand Hotel, where soft sunlight filtered through the tall windows, and distant church bells tolled gently outside. Doctors tried what they could. Messages were sent across the sea. His son Jack came quickly to his side. The days were long, the nights longer, and yet, even as his body weakened, Morgan's face remained calm. He was not afraid. He had lived well, and he knew it. On March 31st, 1913, as dawn broke over the Roman rooftops, J. Pierpont Morgan passed away. No thunder, no headline, just silence. The man who had saved the economy, who had built nations of steel, and light slipped away in the quiet hour, leaving behind no riches in his hand, but a world made stronger by his call. Asterisk pauses noose of Morgan's death rippled across the Atlantic like a slow wave. Flags were lowered, banks paused, churches held quiet services. Even those who had once criticized him stopped to reflect not on the size of his fortune, but on the weight of his example. The President of the United States said, "The country has lost a great leader in finance, but even more so, a man of integrity." And across New York, bells rang softly for the banker who had never chased applause, yet had earned the world's respect. Morgan's body was returned to America aboard his beloved yacht, the Corsair, now draped in black. The same ship that had carried him in youth and strength now carried him home in stillness. Along the harbor, workers stood with hats in hand. Businessmen stopped in the streets. Church choirs sang hymns as the Corsair moved slowly up the Hudson River, her sails lowered in mourning. There were no speeches, no parades, only silence, just as he would have wanted. Morgan was laid to rest in Hartford, Connecticut, not far from where his story had begun so many years ago. A simple stone marked his grave. No towers, no gold, but his real monument would stand elsewhere. In the libraries he built, the companies he steadied, the lives he touched, the values he passed on, the House of Morgan would live on not as a memory, but as a guiding force. After his death, people continued to speak his name, not with fear, but with reverence. He had proven something rare, that a man could have power without arrogance, wealth without vanity, influence without noise. His story was not a tale of noise and conquest. It was a song of structure, grace, and responsibility. And so now, dear listener, as this chapter gently closes, take one more look at the image of Morgan in his final season, an older man seated by a sunlit window, a book resting in his lap, a breath slow and steady. Outside, the world turns, but inside, there is peace. Let this calm carry you to rest. Let the life of Morgan remind you that true greatness often walks softly. Good night when you're ready. Chapter 10 will offer a final reflection, a soft farewell, and a thank you to the man who taught the world that silence can build more than sound ever could. Chapter 10, the echo of quiet strength, farewell, and the calm that lives on the world did not stop when J.P. Morgan passed away. Trains still ran across the wide country he helped connect. Lights still glowed in homes warmed by his work. Books still rested on shelves in the library he had built, and in boardrooms, offices, and quiet corners of the world. His presence could still be felt not in voice or body, but in principle. For Morgan's greatest creation was not steel or money or railroads. It was trust. After his death, others carried on his work. His son, Jack Morgan, stepped into the firm's leadership with grace and wisdom. The House of Morgan endured through wars, crashes, recoveries, and revolutions, not because it shouted the loudest, but because it stood the calmest. And still today, in books, in museums, and in whispered histories, Morgan's legacy lives not in greed, not in pride, but in balance, patience, and purpose. J.P. Morgan was not perfect. He could be stern. He was powerful, and yes, sometimes misunderstood. But he taught the world a lesson that still matters now, that strength does not need to be loud, that order brings peace, and that a single person moving steadily, thinking clearly, acting with honor can shape the future in ways more lasting than gold. So close your eyes now and imagine Himmelder, He stands by the edge of a quiet harbor. His coat rustles softly in the wind. His yacht, the Corsair, waits in the water, sails lower, its bell silent. Behind him, the lights of the city glow. Before him, the sea stretches wide, and somewhere, far beyond the horizon, the world continues built, in part by the quiet work of his hands. And now, dear friend, the story ends, but its feeling remains. Let it rest beside you like a warm blanket. Let the memory of J.P. Morgan's stillness ease your breath. Let his calm guide you into sleep. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey. Good night. Sleep peacefully, and I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow.